Ivy Marchetti had circled the dates on her kitchen calendar back in September with a green pen, the same green pen she used for things that mattered to her specifically and not to anyone else. Dentist appointments got blue. Work deadlines got red. But this, for days at a cabin outside Gatlinburg booked through a rental site she'd bookmarked for over a year, got green. December 23rd through the 27th. She'd paid the deposit the same week she booked it, non-refundable, because making it non-refundable was the only way she trusted herself not to talk herself out of it later. The way she'd talked herself out of so many smaller versions of this exact plan over the years. She was 26, worked as a project coordinator for a regional engineering firm, and had spent most of her adult life occupying a very specific role within the Marchetti family that nobody had ever formally assigned to her, but that everyone, including Ivy herself, had come to treat as simply factual. She was the one who could just do things. She could just watch the kids. She could just pick up Grandma Rosalind's prescription on her way home. She could just swing by and help her father, Gary, move the furniture around after his knee surgery, could just cover Danielle's shift at the family's small insurance office when Danielle's babysitter canceled, could just, an entire adulthood constructed out of the word just, as though every request made of her were small enough not to require actual consideration. Her older sister Danielle had married young, at 23, to a contractor named Mark who worked long hours and traveled often, and had 3 children in reasonably quick succession: Owen, now 7, Presley, 5, and Mia, who just turned 2 that October. Danielle loved her kids fiercely and exhaustedly in the specific way of a woman who'd had very little help and very little sleep for the better part of 7 years, and Ivy genuinely didn't begrudge her sister the need for a break. What Ivy begrudged, if she let herself be honest about it in the quiet of her own apartment, was the reflexive, unquestioned assumption, shared by both her father and her sister and reinforced over years of Ivy's simply absorbing whatever was asked of her, that Ivy's time existed in some fundamentally different category than everyone else's. Danielle's trips were sacred. Gary's golf games were sacred. Ivy's plans were, at best, provisional, subject to cancellation the moment something more important came along, and something more important always came along. She told her father about the cabin trip back in October, mentioned it casually over Sunday dinner at his house, the way she mentioned most things she cared about, carefully, almost apologetically, already half expecting the news to slide past him unregistered. "I booked myself a little trip for after Christmas," she'd said. "A cabin, just me for days. I think I really need it this year." Gary had nodded, distracted, scrolling something on his phone, and said, "Good for you, kiddo," in the tone he used for things he wasn't actually listening to. She'd mentioned it again at Thanksgiving, this time more directly, specifically because some instinct in her, some old, well-earned wariness, had told her it needed reinforcing. Just a reminder, I'm doing that cabin trip the week after Christmas. 23rd through the 27th. Her father had said, right, the mountains thing. And Danielle, half listening while wrangling Mia into a high chair, had said, "That sounds nice, Ives," in a voice that suggested she'd already forgotten it by the time she finished the sentence. The call came on the evening of December 19th, 4 days before Ivy was meant to load her car and drive south. She was in the middle of doing laundry, phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, when her father's name lit up the screen. "Hey, so, change of plans," Gary said, without preamble, in the particular harried tone he used whenever he was about to ask for something and had already, somewhere in his own head, decided that her answer didn't really factor into the outcome. Danielle and Mark's flight for the anniversary trip got moved up, some airline schedule thing. They're leaving the 23rd now instead of the 27th. "And you know my knee's still a mess from the surgery. I can't be chasing 3 kids around a house for a week, not with the stairs and everything. You're not doing anything for the holidays anyway, right?" Ivy stood very still in her small laundry room, a damp towel still in her hand.
"Dad,
"I told you about the cabin. In October. And again at Thanksgiving." There was a pause on the line, the specific kind of pause that meant her father was searching for a version of events where he hadn't simply failed to retain information he'd found inconvenient. "The mountain thing? I thought that was like a maybe." "It wasn't a maybe. I paid for it in September. It's non-refundable." "Well, Gary exhaled, and Ivy could picture him exactly, standing in his kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck the way he did whenever he was about to reframe a problem as someone else's to solve. I mean, I already told Danielle you'd help out. She's counting on it at this point. The flights are booked, Mark's parents already turned it down because of their own trip, and I really can't do it solo with this knee. She's going to be crushed if this falls through now. Ivy, you know how she gets when things don't work out. Ivy felt something familiar and exhausting settle over her. Not quite anger. Not yet. More like the specific weariness of watching a trap close that she'd somehow still walked into despite seeing its exact shape from 100 yards away. Her father hadn't asked her. He'd told Danielle yes on Ivy's behalf, days or possibly weeks earlier, without a single conversation with Ivy herself, and had only called now, for days out, once the arrangement was already load-bearing enough that refusing it would mean becoming the reason her sister's anniversary trip collapsed. You already told her I'd do it, Ivy said slowly. Before you even asked me. I mean, I figured you would, you always do, and I didn't want to stress her out with the uncertainty while she's trying to get everything packed. Dad, I have a non-refundable cabin booked. I've had this planned for 3 months. Can't you just push it back a week? Or, I don't know, get a partial refund, explain the situation? It's a small rental company, Dad. There's no partial refund. It's non-refundable. That's what non-refundable means. Gary sighed, the long-suffering sigh of a man who felt himself to be the truly put-upon party in this conversation. Look, I'm not asking you to do this forever. It's like 9 days, Christmas Eve to New Year's, and it's not like you've got some big family of your own waiting on you. I really don't know what else to tell you, Ivy. Danielle's counting on this. Are you really going to be the one who ruins her trip over a cabin? And there it was, laid out plainly the way it always eventually was in this family. The frame already built, the only 2 options on offer being helpful Ivy or the sister who ruined the anniversary trip, with no acknowledgement anywhere in the conversation that a third option, the trip Ivy had actually planned and paid for herself, the trip that existed entirely independent of anyone else's needs, carried any weight at all in the calculation. She canceled the cabin that night, sitting on the edge of her bed with the confirmation email open on her laptop, watching the cancellation policy remind her, in small gray text, that no refund would be issued for reservations canceled within 30 days of check-in. She didn't cry exactly. She felt something more like a familiar, worn-smooth resignation, the sensation of a groove in a record being played for the 1,000th time, the needle finding its way automatically into a pattern it already knew by heart. 3 days later, she arrived at her father's house on Christmas Eve morning with an overnight bag and a bag of groceries for the week, and by noon she was on her knees on the kitchen floor negotiating with a 5-year-old over the color of a plastic cup, while her father sat in the next room with his bad knee propped up on an ottoman, calling out occasional, unhelpful suggestions toward a problem he had no intention of getting up to help solve. By December 27th, Ivy had lost track of what day it actually was in any meaningful sense, the way exhaustion tends to flatten time into a single undifferentiated stretch measured only in feedings and meltdowns, and the increasingly desperate hope of nap windows. Owen, 7, was old enough to mostly entertain himself with a tablet but young enough to erupt into sudden, baffling grievances about screen time limits or the unfairness of bedtime. Presley, 5, had entered a phase of intense, specific preferences, the wrong color cup, the wrong brand of goldfish crackers, the wrong episode of the wrong show, that could detonate into a full meltdown with almost no warning. And Mia, 2, required a level of constant physical vigilance that left Ivy feeling, by the end of each day, like she'd been holding her breath for 12 hours straight. Gary had been present for approximately none of it in any way that counted. He'd shown up for the performance of helping, sitting in the living room while the kids watched a movie, occasionally calling out, "You doing okay in there?" from his recliner while Ivy handled dinner, bath time, and bedtime alone in the kitchen and bathroom down the hall. His knee, he reminded her often, wasn't what it used to be. He'd had the surgery back in September, a partial meniscus repair that his doctor had cleared him to walk on without restriction by early November, a detail Ivy happened to know because she was the one who'd driven him to the follow-up appointment where the doctor had said exactly that. She hadn't brought it up. She'd learned, over the years, that pointing out her father's inconsistencies rarely accomplished anything beyond making him defensive, and defensive Gary was, if anything, even less helpful than distracted Gary. On the morning of the 27th, Ivy was on the kitchen floor with Mia, both of them cross-legged amid a scattered pile of wooden blocks, attempting to build a tower tall enough to satisfy the toddler's exacting and mysterious standards, when her phone rang from the counter above her. She saw her grandmother's name on the screen and answered on speaker, since her hands were occupied holding the tower steady against Mia's enthusiastic and destructive curiosity. "Hi, Grandma." "Ivy, dear, I was calling to see how Danielle's trip is going. Has she called you from Cancun yet? I wanted to hear about the resort." Rosalind's voice came through crisp and pleased, the voice of a woman looking forward to a good story. "I haven't talked to her, no. She's pretty unplugged this week, I think." Ivy shifted to catch a block before it toppled onto Mia's head, and, in the process of lunging, knocked the tower over entirely, which triggered an immediate, piercing wail from Mia that filled the kitchen. There was a pause on the line. "Ivy, is that a child crying?" "That's Mia. Yeah, sorry, hang on." Ivy scooped the toddler up, bouncing her automatically, the wail downgrading to a series of hiccuping sobs against her shoulder. "Sorry, Grandma. It's a bit chaotic here." "Where is here, exactly?" Something in Rosalind's tone had shifted, gone careful and precise in a way Ivy recognized from childhood, the tone her grandmother used right before she asked a question she already suspected the answer to and wanted confirmed out loud. "Dad's house," Ivy said. "I've had the kids since the 23rd. "You've had all 3 children since the 23rd. A silence, brief and sharp. "Where is your father right now?" Ivy glanced toward the back door, through which she could see, across the yard, her father's car conspicuously absent from the driveway. "Golfing," she said, too tired at this point to construct anything softer. "He said the kids wear him out too fast, with his knee and everything." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ivy actually pulled the phone away from her ear briefly to check the call hadn't dropped. When Rosalind spoke again, her voice had dropped into something low and level that Ivy would later describe to her therapist, months afterward, as the sound of a decision being made, calmly, by someone who has made a great many decisions in her life and is no longer interested in debating them. "Give me 20 minutes, Rosalind said, and hung up before Ivy could respond. Rosalind Marchetti was 83 years old, had outlived one husband and buried a second, had raised 4 children largely on a single schoolteacher's salary during the years her first husband's construction business went under, and had, in the decade since, become the kind of family matriarch whose calm was understood by everyone who knew her to be considerably more dangerous than anyone else's shouting. She arrived at Gary's house 19 minutes later in the same maroon Buick she'd been driving for 11 years, letting herself in through the side door with a spare key she'd had since before the house was even fully built, back when Gary and Ivy's mother had first broken ground on it decades ago. She found Ivy on the kitchen floor, Mia now calm and stacking blocks again with the particular short memory of toddlers, Owen and Presley arguing in the next room over whose turn it was on the tablet, dishes stacked in the sink from at least 2 meals, and a general atmosphere of quiet, grinding exhaustion that Rosalind absorbed in a single, sweeping glance before she said a word. "Grandma," Ivy said, half rising, "I didn't realize you meant you were coming right now. I would've." "Sit," Rosalind said, not unkindly, and settled herself at the kitchen table with her coat still buttoned, her purse still on her arm, in the posture of a woman who intended to wait exactly as long as necessary and not a minute longer. Gary came home a little over an hour later, golf bag slung over his shoulder, whistling something tuneless as he came through the front door, and stopped whistling entirely the instant he rounded the corner into the kitchen and found his mother sitting at his table, coat on, hands folded, waiting.
"Mom, hey.
Didn't know you were stopping by." He set the golf bag down against the wall with exaggerated casualness. "Everything okay?" "Sit down, Gary." He sat. Ivy, standing awkwardly near the sink with Mia now napping against her shoulder, wasn't sure whether she was meant to leave the room, but Rosalind glanced at her and gave a small shake of the head. "Stay." So Ivy stayed, quietly transferring Mia into the portable playpen in the corner and lowering herself into the third kitchen chair. Rosalind didn't raise her voice. She never had needed to, not once in Ivy's entire memory of her. Her particular gift, the thing that made her more unsettling in an argument than any amount of shouting could have accomplished, was a kind of surgical, unhurried calm that dismantled things piece by piece rather than smashing them all at once. "Whose children are currently asleep in that playpen and arguing over a tablet in the other room?" she asked. "Danielle's kids. Mom, you know that they're staying with us while she and Mark." "I know whose children they are. I'm asking you what you've been doing for the past week while they've been in this house." Gary shifted in his chair. "I've been here. I've been helping." "Have you?" Rosalind's tone remained perfectly even. "Where were you just now?" "The course. Just 9 holes, Mom. I needed to clear my head. This week's been a lot." "A lot for whom?" Rosalind let the question sit in the air for a moment before continuing. "Your knee, as I understand it, was cleared for full activity back in November. Your doctor told you that himself, in front of Ivy, who drove you to that appointment because you claimed you couldn't manage the drive yourself. Did the golf course require less of your knee than 3 children require?" Gary opened his mouth and then closed it again, apparently unable to locate a version of that answer that didn't sound exactly as damning as it was. "Do you understand what you did here, Gary?" Rosalind continued, her voice never rising, never sharpening, simply proceeding with the calm inevitability of something that had already decided where it was going. "You didn't ask your daughter for help. You told your other daughter that help was coming, and only after that arrangement was fully load-bearing did you call Ivy and present it to her as already decided, knowing full well that by the time you called, refusing would mean becoming the reason Danielle's trip collapsed. That's not asking someone for a favor. That's cornering a person and calling it a request." "She always says yes anyway," Gary said, weakly, and Ivy felt something in her chest tighten at hearing it said so plainly, the quiet part of a pattern she'd lived inside for years finally spoken aloud in her father's own voice. "I didn't think it would be a big deal." "She always says yes," Rosalind repeated, "because you have spent her entire adulthood making sure that saying no costs her more than saying yes does. That is not the same thing as her being fine with it, Gary. That is the result of a system you built, whether you meant to or not." She turned then toward Ivy, and her voice, for the first time since she'd walked through the door, softened into something Ivy hadn't heard directed at her specifically in longer than she could easily remember. Not since she was very small, before she'd become useful enough that people stopped needing to be gentle with her. "Go pack a bag, dear." "Grandma, I don't need." "Go pack a bag. I'm taking the children to my house for the rest of the week. You're going to call that cabin rental and see whether you can still salvage a night or 2 of your trip, and if you cannot, you're going to come stay with me instead, and you're going to do absolutely nothing that anyone asks of you for the next several days. I will handle your father." Ivy protested, out of an old habit that ran deeper than conscious thought. "Someone should probably stay and help. It's a lot for one person. Are you sure you're up for it?" And Rosalind simply looked at her with an expression that ended the argument before it had properly begun. "I raised 4 children on my own for the better part of a decade and buried a husband while I did it," she said. "I can manage a week with 3 grandchildren who, unlike some people in this kitchen, actually adore me. What I cannot manage, Ivy, is watching this family continue to do this to you and pretending I haven't noticed."